December 25th, 1066. The newly crowned William the Conqueror stood on the banks of the River Thames, surveying the smoking ruins of Suffolk across the water. London, the greatest city in England, had surrendered without a battle. But the Norman Duke knew that controlling London meant more than accepting the keys to the city gates. It meant building an impregnable fortress that would cast its shadow over the Anglo-Saxon populace for centuries to come. Within weeks, thousands of labourers were demolishing Roman walls and digging foundations for what would become the most infamous fortress in British history, a place where kings would crown themselves, queens would lose their heads, and the fate of England would be decided in blood and stone. This is the story of the Tower of London, a castle that has witnessed more royal blood, political intrigue, and human suffering than perhaps any building on earth. To understand how a single fortress came to embody 1,000 years of English history, we must return to that autumn of 1066, when everything changed forever. The man who built this fortress was no ordinary conqueror. William, Duke of Normandy, had crossed the English Channel with an army of Norman knights and Breton mercenaries, gambling everything on a single battle. On October 14th, 1066, at Hastings, he faced King Harold Godwinson, the last Anglo-Saxon king of England. The battle raged for 9 brutal hours, wave after wave of Norman cavalry crashing against the shield wall of Saxon housecarls. The ground turned to mud mixed with blood. Men screamed and died in their hundreds. The Normans feigned retreat multiple times, drawing the Saxons down from their defensive position on Senlac Hill. Then, in a moment that changed history, an arrow struck Harold in the eye. Some say he was killed instantly. Others claim Norman knights hacked him to pieces as he lay wounded, mutilating his body so badly it could only be identified by his mistress, Edith Swan Neck. Either way, by nightfall the king was dead, England's army was scattered, and the kingdom belonged to William. But victory in battle doesn't guarantee control of a kingdom. William knew this from bitter experience. He had inherited Normandy as an illegitimate child, fought off assassination attempts since age 8, survived rebellions from his own nobles, and conquered neighbouring territories through decades of warfare. He understood that fear was as important as loyalty, and that nothing inspired fear quite like an impregnable fortress overlooking your conquered subjects. As William approached London, taking a circuitous route through the south and east, burning villages and laying waste to the countryside, he was sending a message: submit or be destroyed. Canterbury fell without resistance when Archbishop Stigand came out to offer submission. Dover's garrison surrendered when they saw the size of William's army, though William ordered the castle fortified and left a Norman garrison. Winchester, the old capital of Wessex and location of the royal treasury, opened its gates. And finally, after weeks of isolation, with supply lines cut and Norman armies surrounding the city, London's leaders walked out in early December to meet the conqueror and offer him the crown. Archbishop Ealdred of York performed the coronation ceremony at Westminster Abbey on Christmas Day, 1066. When asked if they accepted William as their king, the Norman and English congregations shouted their approval, the Normans in French, the English in Anglo-Saxon. The Norman guards outside, not understanding English and fearing treachery or riot, set fire to nearby buildings. Panic erupted. People fled the abbey. The ceremony was completed in chaos and smoke, with only a handful of clergy remaining, an ominous beginning to Norman rule that seemed to prophesy the bloodshed ahead. William entered London in triumph, but he didn't trust the city's massive Anglo-Saxon population. London in 1066 was the largest urban centre in Britain, with perhaps 20,000 inhabitants crammed inside Roman walls that had stood for 1,000 years. The city was wealthy, controlling trade routes along the Thames and across the Channel to continental markets. It was proud, with ancient rites and traditions dating back centuries before the Romans came. And it was potentially rebellious, filled with Saxons who had just seen their king killed and their country conquered by foreign invaders who spoke a different language and imposed alien customs. William's solution was elegant and brutal. He would build not one, but 3 castles to control London. Baynard's Castle and Montfichet's Castle guarded the western approaches, where enemies might enter from the countryside. But the greatest fortress, the one that would become synonymous with royal power and terror, was built on the southeastern corner, where the old Roman walls met the River Thames. The location was chosen with military genius. The River Thames provided natural protection on the south side, making assault from that direction nearly impossible. The Thames was London's highway, its source of fish and fresh water, its connection to the sea and continental trade. Controlling the riverbank meant controlling London's commerce. The Roman walls, still standing strong after 9 centuries, formed the eastern and northern defences. These walls, built around 200 AD when London was Londinium, capital of Roman Britain, were 12 feet thick and 18 feet high, studded with towers and gates. They had been maintained through the Saxon period and remained formidable obstacles. William's engineers simply had to build on the western side to create an enclosed fortress. But William wanted more than a simple fortification. He wanted a palace, a stronghold, a statement of permanence that would announce to all of England, "The Normans are here to stay." Norman castles were already dotting the English landscape. William had built dozens during his conquest campaign, each one a declaration of Norman power planted in hostile territory. York had received 2 castles. Exeter had 1. Nottingham, Lincoln, Cambridge, Huntingdon all had Norman fortresses rising from English soil. But the London fortress would be different. It would be the greatest castle in England, the physical embodiment of the conquest itself. The initial fortress was probably timber, a wooden palisade surrounding a bailey with earthwork ramparts and a ditch. This would have been constructed rapidly in late 1066 or early 1067, giving William a secure base in the hostile city. Contemporary accounts mention that fortifications were completed in the city against the restlessness of the huge and brutal populace. The chronicler William of Poitiers wrote that William realized it was of the first importance to overawe the Londoners. Timber castles were standard Norman practice. William had built dozens across Normandy and during his conquest of England. They could be erected in weeks, required only local materials and unskilled labour, and provided adequate defence against infantry assault. Saxon London, watching Norman soldiers drive timber stakes into the ground and raise wooden towers, must have seethed with resentment. But timber rots, timber burns, and timber doesn't inspire the kind of awe that William wanted. Timber was temporary. It was a statement that you might not stay. Stone was permanent. Stone said, "We are here forever." So in 1078, 12 years after the conquest, William made a decision that would define the tower's character for the next millennium. He ordered the construction of a great stone keep. This wasn't just any keep. It would be the largest, most imposing donjon in England, rising 90 feet above the Thames, its white limestone walls visible for miles in every direction. The man William chose to oversee this monumental project was Gundulf, Bishop of Rochester, a Norman cleric with experience in castle building and engineering. Gundulf was a remarkable figure, a Benedictine monk who had studied at the monastery of Bec in Normandy, where he became friends with Lanfranc, who would become Archbishop of Canterbury. Gundulf had a reputation for piety combined with practical administrative skill. He was known as Gundulf the Weeper because he cried easily during prayers and religious services. But this emotional sensitivity didn't prevent him from being an effective administrator and builder. He understood architecture, had supervised building projects before, and most importantly, had William's complete trust. Building the greatest fortress in England required someone who could manage vast quantities of money, coordinate hundreds of workers, source materials from across England and France, and deliver results on a project that would take years or even decades. Gundulf was that man. The White Tower was revolutionary in English castle architecture. Before the conquest, English fortifications were primarily earthwork defences, ditches, ramparts, wooden palisades. The few stone structures that existed were mostly religious buildings, churches, abbeys, cathedrals. Secular architecture was overwhelmingly timber. The Normans brought sophisticated stone castle construction to England, techniques developed over generations in France and refined through constant warfare. The White Tower represented the pinnacle of this technology, a keep so massive, so powerfully built, that it would dominate London's skyline for 900 years. The building measured 118 feet by 105 feet at its base, with walls that were 15 feet thick at the ground level, tapering to 11 feet at the top. To put this in perspective, 15 feet is wider than most modern rooms. You could drive a car through the thickness of those walls. This immense thickness wasn't merely for defense, though it certainly made the walls nearly impervious to the siege weapons of the time. Trebuchets, mangonels, battering rams, siege towers. The thickness also allowed for the construction of internal chambers, spiral staircases, and passages within the walls themselves. The tower was like a castle within a castle. Even if attackers somehow breached the outer face of the wall, they would still have to fight through interior chambers and passages before reaching the building's heart. The primary building material was Kentish ragstone, a hard, durable limestone quarried from the North Downs south of London, particularly around Maidstone. Ragstone is tough stuff. It weathers well, resists erosion, and was available in enormous quantities relatively close to London. But quarrying it was brutal, dangerous work. Medieval quarrymen used hammer and chisel to split the stone along natural fault lines, then shaped it roughly at the quarry before loading it onto wagons or boats. A single block might weigh several hundred pounds. Thousands upon thousands of tons of this stone were transported to the construction site, probably by barge along the Thames and River Medway. Imagine the logistics. Stone quarried in Kent, loaded onto barges at Maidstone or other riverside quarries, floated down the Medway to its confluence with the Thames at Rochester, then west along the Thames to London. Each barge carried several tons of stone, and the project required hundreds of shipments over many years. Barges were the freight trains of the medieval world, slow, weather-dependent, but capable of moving quantities of heavy cargo that would be impossible by wagon. The Thames was tidal, and skilled bargemen had to time their journeys to take advantage of the tides, riding the flood tide upstream to London. But ragstone, while durable, is rough and difficult to work with precision. Its surface is uneven, and it can't be carved with fine detail. For the decorative elements, the window surrounds, door frames, corner quoins, and architectural details, the builders imported Caen stone from Normandy. This fine-grained limestone from William's homeland could be carved with precision and gave the building its distinctive appearance. Caen stone was pale, almost white when freshly cut, which is why the building came to be called the White Tower. In 1240, Henry III ordered the entire exterior whitewashed, making it gleam even more brilliantly, visible from miles away as a symbol of royal power. The stone was quarried near Caen in Normandy, transported overland by wagon to the Norman coast, probably to the port of Ouistreham or Caen itself, loaded onto ships, sailed across the English Channel, then brought up the Thames to London. The Channel crossing was dangerous. Medieval ships were small by modern standards, powered by a single square sail and oars. Storms could sink them, pirates could attack them, navigation errors could wreck them on shoals or rocks. Every decorative element on the White Tower's facade represented stone that had survived a journey of over 100 miles by land and sea at enormous expense and risk. Labor for the project came from multiple sources. Skilled Norman stonemasons directed the work, men who had learned their trade building churches and castles in France. These master craftsmen were respected, well paid, and absolutely essential. They understood structural engineering by practical experience, if not by mathematical theory, knew how to cut stones so they fitted together perfectly without gaps, could read architectural plans, probably simple drawings on parchment or wooden boards, and supervised teams of workers. Below them in the hierarchy were experienced masons who could cut and shape stone according to instructions. These were skilled craftsmen who spent years learning their trade, working their way up from apprentices to journeymen to masters. Then came the masses of labourers, Anglo-Saxon workers, some paid, many conscripted. The Normans imposed labour obligations on conquered Saxons, requiring them to work on royal projects for a certain number of days per year. This was feudal obligation. In exchange for the right to farm land and live in England under Norman protection, Saxons owed labour service. So Saxon hands built the fortress that would dominate Saxon London for centuries. Bitter irony that would not have been lost on the workers hauling stone and mixing mortar. Medieval accounts don't provide exact numbers, but a project of this scale would have required hundreds of workers simultaneously. During peak construction periods, probably in summer when weather was favourable and daylight long, the site would have swarmed with activity. Quarrymen extracting and shaping stone, bargemen transporting it, masons cutting and laying it, labourers mixing mortar made from lime, sand and water, and hauling materials up wooden scaffolding. Carpenters built scaffolding, working platforms, and the wooden centering used to support arches during construction until the mortar set. Blacksmiths forged tools, chisels, hammers, saws, iron fittings for doors and shutters. Carters hauled timber for scaffolding from forests outside London. The worksite would have been deafening, the constant hammering of chisel on stone, the rumble of carts, the shouts of foremen directing workers, the splash of barges unloading at the riverside wharf, the creak of wooden cranes lifting stone blocks. The smell would have been distinctive. Fresh-cut stone, wood smoke from lime kilns where limestone was burned to make lime for mortar, river mud, horse dung, human sweat. Construction sites in the Middle Ages were not pleasant places. The work continued year after year, through winters when frost made mortar useless and construction halted, through summers when the heat made labour brutal and the Thames sometimes ran low, complicating barge transport. Workers died, falls from scaffolding, stones dropping on them, crushed by carts, disease, simple exhaustion. Medieval construction was extraordinarily dangerous. No safety regulations existed. Scaffolding was basic and could collapse. Workers laboured 60 or 70 feet above ground with no protection. But the work continued because William had commanded it, and William's commands were enforced with absolute authority backed by military force. The design of the White Tower reflected its dual purpose as fortress and royal residence. The building rose 3 stories above a basement level. The basement, partially underground on the north side, where the building was terraced into the slope, served as storage space. Barrels of salted meat and fish, sacks of grain, casks of wine and ale, and contained a well to ensure water supply during a siege. Medieval siege warfare often came down to who ran out of water first. A well inside your fortress meant you could hold out indefinitely, provided you had food. The well at the tower was deep, probably 40 or 50 feet, dug through Thames mud and clay to reach groundwater. The basement walls were lit only by narrow slits, arrow loops that admitted minimal light but prevented attackers from firing in or climbing through. The entrance to the White Tower was originally at the first floor level, reached by a wooden staircase that could be removed in case of attack. This was standard practice for Norman keeps. Making the entrance accessible only by a removable staircase meant that even if attackers breached the outer defences, they couldn't easily force their way into the keep itself. They would need to bring siege ladders or build their own stairs under constant fire from defenders above. a nearly impossible task if the defenders had any arrows left. In later centuries, probably during Henry II's reign in the mid-12th century, a stone forebuilding was added to the south face, providing additional protection to the entrance with its own set of doors and defences. This forebuilding has not survived into modern times, demolished in the 17th century, but archaeological evidence confirms its existence. Inside, the first floor was divided into 3 main chambers. The largest room, occupying the western half of the building, was probably used by the Constable of the Tower, the military commander responsible for the fortress's defence and day-to-day operations. This was a position of immense trust and power. The constable controlled access to the fortress, commanded its garrison, oversaw its supplies and finances, administered justice for crimes committed within the tower's jurisdiction, and in the king's absence essentially ruled London's most strategic stronghold. The position was usually given to one of the king's most trusted nobles, someone whose loyalty was beyond question, whose military skill was proven, and whose political judgment was sound. The constable's chamber would have been furnished with a bed, tables, chairs, chests for storing clothes and documents, and a fireplace for warmth. To the northeast was a smaller chamber, possibly used for storage or as quarters for senior officers, the lieutenant of the tower, who served as the constable's deputy, or the master of the ordnance, responsible for weapons and ammunition. And in the southeast corner stood one of the White Tower's most remarkable features, the Chapel of St. John the Evangelist. The Chapel of St. John occupies 2 stories of the White Tower, with the apse, the semicircular eastern end traditional in church architecture, projecting from the southeast corner. The apse's projection is clearly visible in the building's exterior and has become one of the tower's most recognizable features, a rounded bulge on the otherwise rectangular keep. Inside, the chapel is surprisingly spacious and light, especially considering it's embedded in a fortress designed for war. The floor measures about 55 feet by 31 feet, and the ceiling vaults rise nearly 30 feet overhead. Massive cylindrical pillars, over 4 feet in diameter, support rounded Norman arches that march down the chapel in perfect rhythm. These aren't delicate Gothic arches that would come into fashion a century later, with their pointed shapes and soaring height. They're heavy, powerful, Romanesque arches that speak of strength and permanence. The pillars are so thick that 3 or 4 people holding hands couldn't encircle them. The capitals of the columns are decorated with simple geometric patterns, zigzags, chevrons, and abstract designs typical of early Norman style. The Normans hadn't yet adopted the elaborate sculptural decoration that would characterize later medieval architecture. Carved leaves, biblical scenes, grotesque faces. This chapel was built in an age when ornament meant geometry, when beauty meant proportion and solid craftsmanship rather than decorative flourish. The walls are thick stone, the windows relatively small by later standards, but large enough to flood the space with light during daylight hours. The windows are round-arched, set deep in the thick walls, and would have originally contained clear glass or perhaps simple-coloured glass, nothing like the elaborate stained glass that would become popular in Gothic cathedrals. The floor would have been paved with stone, probably with some decorative tiles near the altar. In the 13th century, during Henry III's reign, the chapel was lavishly decorated. Henry was obsessed with religious art and architecture, spending enormous sums beautifying churches and chapels throughout his kingdom. Westminster Abbey was essentially rebuilt during his reign in the new Gothic style. At the tower, he added a gold-painted cross, probably suspended from the ceiling or mounted behind the altar. Stained glass windows depicted the Virgin Mary and the Holy Trinity in brilliant colors: ruby red, sapphire blue, emerald green, golden yellow. Medieval stained glass was extraordinarily beautiful, coloured with metallic oxides that caught and transformed sunlight into pools of coloured brilliance on the floor and walls. These windows would have transformed the chapel into a jewel box of coloured light when the sun shone through them. The floor was probably tiled in geometric patterns of red, yellow, black, and white tiles. Tapestries hung on the walls, providing insulation against cold and depicting religious scenes. The altar was covered in fine linen and silk embroidered with gold thread, adorned with gold and silver vessels for the Mass, chalices, patens, candlesticks. Today, the chapel has been restored to something approximating its original Norman appearance, austere, powerful, and deeply atmospheric. The decorative elements are gone, stripped away by later generations who had different aesthetic preferences or different religious convictions. What remains is stone and space, light and shadow, silence and sanctity. Standing in St. John's Chapel today, you're in a room that has remained essentially unchanged structurally for over 900 years. Norman kings prayed here, queens knelt before the altar, knights kept vigil here before battle, spending the night in prayer according to medieval tradition. Prisoners awaiting execution sought consolation here, praying for forgiveness and salvation. The stone remembers everything, though it keeps its secrets. The second floor of the White Tower contained the royal apartments, the most prestigious space in the entire building. The western chamber was the great hall, where the king would dine, receive visitors, conduct court business, and preside over the rituals of medieval kingship when in residence at the Tower. Medieval great halls were the centres of court life, part throne room, part dining room, part courtroom, part theatre, where the drama of monarchy was performed for audiences of nobles, clergy, and foreign ambassadors. The king would sit at the high table, raised on a dais at one end of the hall, with his most important nobles seated near him in order of rank. Lesser courtiers and servants ate at lower tables arranged perpendicular to the high table, forming a T-shape that was standard in medieval halls. Meals were elaborate affairs, especially on feast days, Christmas, Easter, Pentecost, the king's birthday. Multiple courses would be served, roasted meats, game birds, fish on fast days, pies, pastries, cheese, fruit. Everything was served on silver and gold plate to demonstrate the king's wealth. Musicians played during meals, lutes, harps, drums, sometimes singers. Entertainers might perform, jugglers, acrobats, storytellers. The hall would be lit by candles and torches mounted in iron brackets on the walls, making it a blazing spectacle on winter evenings when darkness fell early. The eastern chamber was the royal bedchamber, the king's private apartment. Medieval kings didn't have much privacy. Even their bedchambers were often crowded with servants, guards, and courtiers. But this was as close as they got. The chamber would have contained the royal bed, an enormous piece of furniture hung with heavy curtains that could be drawn closed for privacy and warmth. Medieval beds were status symbols. The king's bed would have been carved and decorated, piled with feather mattresses, covered with silk and velvet blankets, surrounded by curtains of expensive fabric. Chests for storing clothes and valuables lined the walls. A fireplace provided heat, essential in winter when stone castles were bitterly cold. Tapestries covered the stone walls, providing insulation and decoration. The most valuable tapestries were woven with threads of gold and silver, depicting scenes from classical mythology, the Bible, or contemporary history. A good tapestry might cost as much as a war horse. Originally, both the great hall and the bedchamber were open to the roof, surrounded by galleries built into the thickness of the walls. These galleries, essentially walkways built within the walls themselves, allowed servants to move about the building discreetly, and provided additional space for guards and attendants. You could walk through the walls of the White Tower, passing from chamber to chamber via passages that were invisible from the rooms themselves. An architectural feature, that later gave rise to legends of secret passages and hidden chambers where prisoners were supposedly confined or murdered. In the southeast corner of the second floor, the upper level of St. John's Chapel served as the king's private oratory, where he could attend Mass without leaving the security of his apartments. A door connected the royal bedchamber directly to the chapel gallery, so the king could literally walk from his bed to his prayers in moments. Medieval kings were expected to hear Mass daily. It was a religious obligation and a political necessity. A king who neglected his religious duties risked both divine punishment and earthly criticism from clergy and nobles. Having a chapel directly adjacent to the royal apartments meant the king could fulfill his obligations conveniently and safely. The top floor was added in the 15th century, along with the present roof, altering the building's original proportions, but providing additional space for garrison quarters and storage. Throughout the building, the architects incorporated features for comfort as well as defense. 4 large fireplaces provided heat in winter, an unusual luxury for the time. Most medieval buildings made do with central hearths that filled rooms with smoke. Proper fireplaces with chimneys that carried smoke outside were sophisticated technology requiring skilled masonry. The chimneys had to draw properly, or they would fill rooms with deadly smoke. Latrines were built into the thickness of the walls, small chambers with stone seats pierced with holes that discharged directly into cesspits or into the moat below. Medieval sanitation wasn't sophisticated by modern standards, but having indoor latrines was considerably more pleasant than the alternative of chamber pots or outdoor privies. Windows, though small by later standards and originally designed primarily for defense, provided light and ventilation. The window openings were splayed inward, meaning they were narrow slits on the outside, perhaps 6 inches wide, but widened considerably on the inside to 2 or 3 feet. This design served multiple purposes. It admitted maximum light while presenting minimal target to attackers outside. It allowed defenders to fire arrows out at various angles while making it difficult for enemies to fire in, and it created window seats where people could sit in the light to read, sew, or simply enjoy the view. The construction of the White Tower probably continued through the 1080s and into the 1090s. William the Conqueror died in 1087, killed in one of history's most absurd royal deaths. He was besieging the French town of Mantes in July 1087, part of his endless warfare with the King of France over border territories. Mantes resisted, and William ordered it burned. As William rode through the burning town on his war horse, the horse stumbled on hot ashes and coals in the street. William, who was enormously fat by this point in his life, contemporaries describe him as corpulent and heavy, was thrown violently forward against the iron pommel of his saddle, suffering internal injuries to his abdomen. The injury turned septic, and over the next 6 weeks William suffered horribly. His abdomen swelled grotesquely, and he developed fever. Medieval medicine could do nothing for internal injuries. Surgery was primitive and usually fatal, antibiotics didn't exist, and the concept of infection wasn't understood. William lay dying in a priory near Rouen, in agony. In his final days, most of his courtiers abandoned him, rushing to Normandy or England to secure positions in the new regime, to claim lands they hoped to grab in the chaos of succession, to curry favor with William's sons. This was typical medieval behavior. A dying king had nothing left to offer, but his heirs controlled the future. William died on September 9th, 1087, attended only by clergy and a few loyal servants. Even his personal servants abandoned his body, stealing what they could from the room before fleeing. William's body was transported to Caen for burial in the Abbey of St. Stephen, which William had founded decades earlier as penance for marrying his cousin Matilda without papal dispensation. But the funeral was a disaster. As the body was being lowered into the tomb, a local man stood up and shouted that William had built the church on land stolen from his family. The man's father had owned the land, and William had simply seized it without compensation. The man demanded payment before he would allow the burial to proceed. The bishops, desperate to complete the ceremony, negotiated a price, several pounds of silver, and paid the man off. Even in death, William couldn't escape controversy and resentment. William's son, William II, called Rufus for his red hair and ruddy complexion, inherited England. Normandy went to William's eldest son, Robert Curthose. Robert was the eldest, but William the Conqueror considered him unreliable and had refused to give him England, the greater prize. This division would cause problems for decades, as future English kings tried to reunite the two territories, leading to wars between brothers and eventually Robert's imprisonment for life after he invaded England to claim the throne. William Rufus was a controversial king, irreligious by medieval standards, probably homosexual, though medieval concepts of sexuality were different from modern ones, certainly unmarried and childless, ruthlessly efficient at extracting money from his subjects. He had learned from his father that money was power, and he squeezed England for every penny. He kept bishoprics vacant after bishops died so he could collect their revenues. He taxed his barons heavily. He sold offices and privileges. He was unpopular, but effective. He continued his father's building program at the Tower, and the Great Keep was probably completed around 1100, just in time for its first famous prisoner. Ranulph Flambard, Bishop of Durham, was one of the most hated men in England. As chief tax collector for William II, Flambard had perfected the art of squeezing money from the English population. He charged fees for everything, exploited his position to sell church offices to the highest bidder, a practice called simony that was technically forbidden by church law but widely practiced, and accumulated a personal fortune that rivaled the king's. The chroniclers described him as greedy, manipulative, shameless, and utterly corrupt. One wrote that Flambard fleeced everyone he could reach. Another called him the enemy of God and man. When William II died in a hunting accident in August 1100, shot through the lung with an arrow in circumstances that remain deeply suspicious, the new king, Henry I, needed to demonstrate his commitment to justice and reform after his brother's oppressive reign. Arresting the universally despised Flambard was perfect politics. Flambard was imprisoned in the White Tower in late 1100, the first recorded prisoner held there. This established a tradition that would last nearly 900 years. But if Henry thought that imprisoning the bishop would be simple, he badly underestimated his captive. Flambard was held in relative comfort, as befitted his status as a bishop and nobleman. Medieval imprisonment wasn't like modern prison. There were no cells, no uniforms, no strict routines. High-status prisoners were given rooms, allowed servants, permitted to furnish their quarters. Flambard was given good food and drink. He was even permitted to order wine from outside the fortress, wine being essential to celebrating Mass, and Flambard was, after all, a bishop, even if a corrupt one. On February 2nd, 1101, Flambard hosted a feast for his guards. He had wine brought in from outside, good wine, expensive wine, not the vinegar that ordinary soldiers drank, but fine imported wine from France. The feast went on for hours, with course after course of food and cup after cup of wine. The guards, perhaps bored with their duty guarding a middle-aged bishop, perhaps bribed with money in addition to wine, perhaps simply enjoying the bishop's lavish hospitality, drank freely. As the evening progressed and the guards became increasingly drunk, Flambard made his move. In a secluded chamber, he produced a rope that had been smuggled to him. The rope had been concealed in a cask of wine, wrapped around the inside of the barrel, covered by the wine. The rope was probably brought by a confederate posing as a wine merchant, or perhaps one of Flambard's servants had arranged it. While his guards slept off their stupor, snoring in drunken oblivion, Flambard climbed to a window overlooking the Thames side of the tower. He tied the rope securely to a column or window bar, accounts aren't specific, tested it, and began lowering himself into the darkness. It was February, bitterly cold, and the descent was into darkness. The drop from the first floor level to the ground was at least 40 feet, perhaps 50. The rope, it turned out, wasn't quite long enough. Either it had been mismeasured, or it had stretched under Flambard's weight. Flambard descended as far as the rope allowed, found himself still dangling 10 or 12 feet above the ground, and had no choice but to let go and drop. He hit the ground hard, landing heavily, injuring his hands badly. Some accounts say he broke fingers or wrists, others that he simply tore the skin badly from gripping the rope. But he was outside the tower, in the darkness, and he was free. Confederates were waiting with a horse. Despite his injured hands, despite being 50 years old and overweight, Flambard mounted and rode through the night. He made his way to the coast, probably to a port where a ship was waiting, and sailed to Normandy, where Duke Robert Curthose gave him sanctuary. The escape caused a sensation throughout England. How could the most secure fortress in England lose its most important prisoner on only his second month of captivity? Contemporary chroniclers, searching for an explanation that made sense in their worldview, accused Flambard of witchcraft. How else could he have escaped? Surely only demonic powers could have allowed a fat, middle-aged bishop to climb down a rope from the White Tower in the darkness and get away. The truth, of course, was simpler. Careful planning, bribery, a rope, Confederates with a horse, and enormous physical and moral courage. Descending 40 feet of rope in the darkness with drunken guards who might wake at any moment, then dropping 10 feet to the ground, must have required nerves of steel. Flambard could easily have fallen to his death. The rope could have broken. The guards could have woken. The Confederates might not have been waiting. But Flambard gambled everything on freedom and won. The incident established two traditions that would persist throughout the Tower's history. First, that the Tower was the preeminent royal prison, where the most important and dangerous prisoners were held. If you were arrested for treason, rebellion, or any serious crime against the crown, you went to the Tower. The fortress's name became synonymous with imprisonment. "Sent to the Tower" became a phrase that made people shudder with fear. Second, that despite its fearsome reputation and massive walls, the Tower was not escape-proof. Over the centuries, numerous prisoners would attempt escape, and a surprising number would succeed, at least temporarily. Flambard, incidentally, eventually reconciled with Henry I through skillful negotiation and useful service. He returned to England in 1106, resumed his position as Bishop of Durham, and served there until his death in 1128. He died wealthy and, by medieval standards, respected, despite his spectacular escape from supposedly inescapable captivity. His adventurous spirit and pragmatic flexibility served him well in an age when yesterday's prisoner could become tomorrow's bishop again. In 1097, during William II's reign, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that a wall was built around the tower. This was probably the first stone curtain wall, replacing the timber palisade of the original 1066 fortress. The wall arced around the north and west sides of the White Tower, connecting the Roman wall on the east to the Thames on the south. Building this wall was a major undertaking, requiring thousands of tons of stone, hundreds of workers laboring for months or years, and careful engineering to ensure the wall was strong enough to resist siege weapons. Medieval curtain walls weren't simple barriers like modern fences. They were complex defensive structures, typically 12 to 15 feet thick at the base to resist undermining and battering rams, rising 20 to 30 feet high, topped with crenellations. The alternating raised sections and gaps that are the iconic image of castle walls. The gaps, called crenelles or embrasures, were about 3 feet wide. The raised sections, called merlons, were 5 to 6 feet high and 2 to 3 feet thick. Defenders would stand behind the merlons for protection, step into the crenelles to fire arrows or crossbow bolts at attackers, then step back behind the merlons to reload, while protected from enemy fire. Medieval longbowmen could loose arrows at a rate of 10 to 12 per minute, while crossbowmen, whose weapons were slower to reload but more powerful, managed about 2 to 3 shots per minute. A curtain wall manned by 50 archers could send 500 longbow arrows into an attacking force every minute, a terrifying rate of fire that would decimate infantry advancing across open ground. Add crossbowmen, whose bolts could pierce chain-mail armor, and attacking a well-defended castle wall became nearly suicidal. The curtain wall created an enclosed ward, the innermost ward, that protected the White Tower and provided space for additional buildings essential to castle life. Medieval castles weren't just military installations. They were functioning communities that needed to be self-sufficient, especially during sieges. The innermost ward would have contained multiple structures: barracks for the garrison, typically 50 to 100 soldiers in peacetime, more during emergencies. The garrison included men-at-arms, heavy infantry armed with swords, spears, and shields, archers equipped with longbows, and crossbowmen. Stables housed horses for the garrison cavalry, for royal messengers who needed fast horses to carry communications, and for any nobles or officials residing at the tower. Medieval war horses were expensive. A good destrier, war horse, cost the equivalent of several years' wages for a skilled craftsman. Storehouses held food for the garrison, prisoners, and any royal residents. Salted meat and fish, sacks of grain, barrels of beer and wine, wheels of cheese, dried fruit, nuts, honey, everything needed to survive a siege that might last months. Weapons and ammunition were stored separately. Bundles of arrows, a skilled fletcher could make dozens of arrows per day. Crossbow bolts, spare bowstrings, swords, spears, armor needing repair. Workshops for blacksmiths who repaired armor and weapons and forged iron fittings, carpenters who maintained wooden structures and built siege engines, and other craftsmen occupied permanent buildings or temporary sheds. A well-provided water, absolutely essential for survival. The innermost ward well was deep, dug down to groundwater, and it had to be kept clean and protected from poisoning. A common siege tactic was to throw dead animals or poison into enemy wells. Kitchens prepared meals for the garrison and any prisoners or residents. These were substantial operations with bread ovens, roasting spits, cauldrons for stews and soups. Feeding 100 people required industrial-scale cooking. The tower was evolving from a simple keep into a complex castle, but this was only the beginning. Over the next 2 centuries, expansion after expansion would transform the fortress into one of the most formidable castles in Europe, with 3 concentric rings of walls creating layers of defense that would make the castle nearly impossible to capture by assault. The death of Henry I in 1135 plunged England into chaos that would last nearly 2 decades. Henry had meticulously planned his succession, forcing his barons to swear oaths of loyalty to his daughter Matilda repeatedly. Once in 1127, again in 1131, again in 1133. But planning and reality diverged catastrophically. Henry's only legitimate son, William Adelin, had drowned in 1120 when the White Ship sank while crossing from Normandy to England. The disaster was caused by the ship's crew being drunk. The ship's captain was given wine by William's retinue, and he shared it liberally with his crew, who were celebrating transporting the king's son. They set sail at night, attempting to overtake the king's ship and hit rocks off the Norman coast near Barfleur. The ship sank in minutes. William Adelin got into a small boat and might have survived, but he ordered the boat to return to rescue his illegitimate sister Matilda. The boat was swamped by people trying to climb in, and everyone drowned. Of approximately 300 people aboard, only 1 survived, a butcher from Rouen who clung to debris through the night. The disaster killed not only the heir but dozens of young nobles, effectively wiping out a generation of the Anglo-Norman aristocracy. Contemporary chroniclers wrote that no ship had ever brought such sorrow to England. Henry tried to secure the succession for his daughter Matilda, But many barons had deep reservations about being ruled by a woman. Medieval Europe had few precedents for female rule, and those that existed were often problematic. Women were considered legally subordinate to their fathers and husbands, unsuited for warfare and military command that were essential to kingship. When Henry died in December 1135, reportedly from eating too many lampreys, a kind of eel that he loved despite his physicians warning him that lampreys disagreed with his aging digestion, many barons decided their oaths weren't binding. Henry's nephew, Stephen of Blois, rushed from France to England with astonishing speed, crossing the Channel immediately upon hearing of Henry's death. He seized the royal treasury at Winchester, secured London, and had himself crowned king at Westminster Abbey on December 22, 1135, less than 3 weeks after Henry's death. Stephen was charming, brave in battle, personally popular, generous to his supporters, and completely inadequate as a king. He lacked his uncle's ruthlessness and administrative skill. He made promises he couldn't keep, granted lands and titles lavishly to win support, and then found himself unable to govern effectively because he'd given away too much power. Within months, his position was being challenged. Matilda invaded England in 1139 with the support of her half-brother Robert, Earl of Gloucester, one of the most powerful men in England and fiercely loyal to his sister. Robert was Henry I's favourite illegitimate son. Henry had fathered at least 20 illegitimate children, and Robert was the most capable and trusted. Parts of the country descended into violence as rival factions fought for control. Castles became crucial in this conflict. Controlling castles meant controlling territory, and controlling territory meant being able to claim legitimate kingship. The Tower of London was perhaps the single most important castle in England. Possession of the Tower meant control of London, the kingdom's wealthiest city and traditional capital, and control of London meant the ability to claim you were the rightful ruler. The man who held the Tower in 1135 was Geoffrey de Mandeville, descendant of the Geoffrey de Mandeville who had held it under Henry I. Mandeville understood that his position as Constable of the Tower gave him extraordinary leverage in the Civil War. He could essentially auction his loyalty to the highest bidder, and both Stephen and Matilda desperately needed what he could provide: control of London, access to the Tower's treasury, command of its garrison, and the symbolic legitimacy that came from controlling the kingdom's greatest fortress. At first, Mandeville supported Stephen, and the new king confirmed him in his positions and granted him additional lands and titles: the earldom of Essex, various castles and manors throughout East Anglia, extensive privileges including the right to hold certain courts and collect certain taxes that normally belonged to the crown. Mandeville became enormously wealthy and powerful, one of the greatest magnates in England. But in 1141, everything changed. Stephen was captured by Matilda's forces at the Battle of Lincoln, a catastrophic defeat. The battle was fought in February, in winter conditions, and Stephen fought bravely, wielding first a sword, then an axe when his sword broke, then stones when his axe broke, but was eventually overwhelmed and captured. This seemed to hand the throne to Matilda. Mandeville immediately switched sides, travelling to Oxford, where Matilda held court, and selling his allegiance to her in exchange for even more lands and privileges than Stephen had given him. For nearly a year, Matilda seemed triumphant, and Mandeville grew even wealthier as Constable of the Tower under her regime, exploiting his position to extract money and lands. Then fortune turned again. Matilda's arrogance and her supporters' brutality alienated the population of London. She demanded money from the city to pay her troops, and when the Londoners hesitated, pointing out they had already paid taxes to Stephen, she threatened force. This was a catastrophic political mistake. London's wealth and support were crucial to any claimant to the throne, and Matilda had turned the city against her. The Londoners rioted, and Matilda barely escaped the city. Stephen's queen, also named Matilda of Boulogne, medieval naming conventions were not designed for clarity. led a force that drove the Empress from London before she could be crowned at Westminster Abbey. Stephen was freed in November 1141 in a prisoner exchange. Robert of Gloucester had been captured at Winchester, and the two sides agreed to swap their high-value prisoners. And Mandeville, ever the opportunist, switched sides again, returning his allegiance to Stephen and claiming he had only supported Matilda under duress. By now, Mandeville had become the richest and most powerful man in England, as chroniclers noted with a mixture of admiration and disgust. He controlled multiple castles, commanded a private army of hundreds of knights and thousands of men-at-arms, and held the Tower of London, which meant he controlled England's capital and its treasury. But Mandeville's ambition finally outran his cunning. Stephen discovered that Mandeville was conducting secret negotiations with the Empress Matilda, planning yet another betrayal, trying to position himself to profit regardless of who ultimately won the civil war. The king had him arrested at court, forced him to surrender his castles, including the Tower, and replaced him with a royal loyalist. Mandeville fled, raised a rebellion, and spent his final months ravaging the East Anglian countryside with a mercenary army before he was killed in September 1144, shot in the head with an arrow during a skirmish, the arrow penetrating through the eye opening in his helmet. He died unabsolved of excommunication, so he couldn't be buried in consecrated ground immediately, and his body was preserved in molten lead for years before the excommunication was posthumously lifted and he could be buried. This marked a crucial change in the position of constable. Previously, the office had been hereditary, passing from father to son like other noble titles. Henceforth, it would be an appointment at the king's pleasure, revocable at will. The Constable of the Tower remained one of the most important offices in the kingdom, controlling the kingdom's greatest fortress, commanding its garrison, overseeing the crown's treasury and jewels, administering justice within the Tower's jurisdiction, but it was now firmly under royal control. Future kings would appoint men whose loyalty was beyond question and remove them at the first sign of wavering allegiance. The civil war continued with alternating fortunes through the 1140s. Neither side could win decisively. Matilda controlled the west, Stephen the southeast, and the middle of the country was a patchwork of local lords who switched sides opportunistically or stayed neutral. It was a period remembered as the Anarchy. Chroniclers wrote that Christ and his saints slept because God seemed to have abandoned England. Castles proliferated as local lords built unauthorized fortifications. Mercenaries ravaged the countryside. Trade declined. Monks in their chronicles described suffering. Villages burned, crops destroyed, people starving. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle famously stated, "I know not how to, nor can I tell of all the atrocities and tortures they inflicted upon the wretched people of this country." Finally, exhaustion and the prospect of endless conflict led to a compromise in 1153. Stephen would remain king for his lifetime, but would be succeeded by Matilda's son, Henry of Anjou. Stephen's own son had died in 1153, removing a major obstacle to the agreement. When Stephen died on October 25, 1154, from a stomach ailment or possibly appendicitis, the young Henry II took the throne, beginning one of the most remarkable reigns in medieval English history, a reign that would see the Tower of London expanded and transformed into the great fortress whose outline we still recognize today. Henry II came to the throne at age 21, already seasoned by years of conflict. He was extraordinary, short, stocky, red-haired, with an almost superhuman energy. Contemporaries described him as never sitting down, always moving, exhausting his courtiers. He spoke rapidly, in a jumble of languages, Latin, French, English, sometimes all in the same sentence. Henry inherited not just England, but also Normandy, Anjou, Maine, Touraine, and Aquitaine through his marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine, making him ruler of an empire stretching from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees. The Tower during his years served primarily as a secure treasury and a prison for high-status captives. It was probably during Henry's time that the forebuilding was added to the White Tower's southern entrance. But Henry was usually on the continent, fighting wars, dealing with rebellious sons, and resolving church-state conflicts that culminated in the murder of Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury, by 4 of his knights in 1170. The great era of Tower expansion was coming, brought by 2 kings who understood the fortress needed to become something far greater. When Richard I, the Lionheart, came to the throne in 1189, he left William Longchamp in charge of England and the Tower's expansion. Longchamp was efficient, ruthless, and universally hated. Between 1189 and 1190, the Pipe Rolls record expenditure of £2,881 on the Tower, equivalent to perhaps £8 million today. His major project was digging a moat around the castle. He needed the improved defences because Richard's brother John was plotting to seize the throne. In October 1191, John marched on London. Longchamp retreated to the Tower, but surrendered after only 3 days. Resisting was pointless when John controlled the city. Richard died in 1199 from an infected crossbow wound sustained while besieging a minor castle in France. He forgave the crossbowman who shot him and ordered him given 100 shillings. Then his bodyguard strangled the crossbowman anyway. Richard died at 41, in the arms of his mother Eleanor. John's reign proved catastrophic. By 1214, his misrule had provoked open rebellion. In May 1215, rebel forces marched on London and besieged the Tower. John, desperate, agreed to meet the barons at Runnymede. There, on June 15, 1215, he sealed Magna Carta, not signed as the myth goes, since the king almost certainly couldn't write. The document was primarily designed to protect baronial privileges, not common people's rights. John immediately petitioned the Pope to annul it, and civil war erupted. The barons invited Prince Louis of France to take the throne. Then, in October 1216, John died, probably from dysentery. The circumstances were dramatic. His baggage train was swept away crossing the Wash when the tide came in faster than expected, reportedly taking the crown jewels with it. John died at Newark Castle on October 18th. His death changed everything. His 9-year-old son, under the guidance of William Marshal, the greatest knight of his age, proved far more appealing than a French king. Support for Louis evaporated, and by 1217 the French were gone. Henry III came to the throne at age 9, crowned with a circlet belonging to his mother because the crown jewels were lost. He would reign for 56 years, and his relationship with the Tower would be defining. Henry was pious, artistic, obsessed with architecture. He essentially rebuilt Westminster Abbey during his reign, and a poor military leader. The Tower underwent its most significant expansion in his lifetime. Between 1216 and 1272, Henry spent nearly £10,000 on the Tower, more than any other royal castle except Windsor. He didn't just want a fortress, he wanted a palace. The Queen's chambers were painted with trompe-l'oeil patterns imitating stonework. New towers were built, Wakefield Tower and Lanthorn Tower, with large windows overlooking the Thames, fireplaces, and decorative paintings. A great hall was constructed between the 2 towers for feasting and receiving ambassadors. Beginning around 1238, Henry expanded the castle beyond the line of the old Roman walls for the first time. A new curtain wall created the inner ward, studded with towers. Bell Tower, Beauchamp Tower, Bowyer Tower, Martin Tower, Salt Tower, the Bloody Tower, and others. Each tower served multiple purposes: defensive positions, accommodation, workshops. Bell Tower's bronze bell could sound the alarm across London. Bowyer Tower housed the workshop, making long bows and arrows. The Beauchamp Tower is particularly significant. It represents the first large-scale use of brick in English construction since the Romans left Britain in the 5th century. The Normans had reintroduced brick-making in the 12th century, probably bringing craftsmen from the Low Countries. Beauchamp Tower's brick construction proved spectacularly successful, and brick would eventually become standard throughout England. The Church of St. Peter ad Vincula, originally outside the tower's walls, was now incorporated into the expanded castle. It would achieve grim fame as the burial place for some of the tower's most illustrious victims: Anne Boleyn, Catherine Howard, Lady Jane Grey, Thomas More. It is technically the most distinguished church in England for its concentration of royal and aristocratic graves. Edward I came to the throne in 1272, a seasoned warrior over 6 feet tall, earning him the nickname Longshanks. He had studied castle design obsessively during his crusading years and was everything his father wasn't: a brilliant military commander, ruthless politician, and one of medieval Europe's greatest castle builders. His Welsh castles, Caernarfon, Conwy, Harlech, Beaumaris, remain engineering masterpieces. When he turned his attention to the tower, he brought all of that expertise to bear. Between 1275 and 1285, Edward spent £21,000 on the tower, more than double what his father had spent in 56 years. He filled in Henry's moat and built a new curtain wall, creating the outer ward that completely encircled the castle. A new, larger moat was dug in front of it. The new entrance in the southwest featured elaborate defences: inner gatehouse, outer gatehouse, and a barbican. A killing ground where attackers breaching the outer gate would find themselves trapped under fire from all sides. Edward added St. Thomas's Tower between 1275 and 1279, which eventually became known by a far more sinister name: Traitor's Gate. For centuries, accused traitors brought to the tower by boat would pass under its arch, knowing they might never leave. Anne Boleyn, Thomas More, Princess Elizabeth, Walter Raleigh, all entered through those dark waters. Edward also moved the royal mint into the tower, centralizing England's coinage under crown control. The mint would remain for over 6 centuries, until 1775. Edward's reign also saw one of the tower's darkest chapters. In 1278, 600 Jews were imprisoned, accused of coin clipping. Many were tortured, about 280 were hanged. This was part of a broader campaign of anti-Semitism. In 1290, Edward issued the Edict of Expulsion, ordering all Jews to leave England by November 1st or face death. Some 3,000 to 4,000 Jews were forced into exile, not to return legally for nearly 4 centuries. From the 14th century onward, the tower became the expected fate for fallen politicians and defeated nobles. It was reserved for high-ranking inmates. Common criminals went to grimmer prisons like the Fleet or Newgate. King David II of Scotland spent 11 years imprisoned after capture in 1346, ransomed for 100,000 marks. King John II of France lived in luxury after Poitiers in 1356. These royal prisoners were valuable commodities. A dead king couldn't be ransomed. The Wars of the Roses turned the tower into a prize to be captured and recaptured. In 1460, Yorkist forces besieged it, and for the first time gunpowder weapons seriously threatened the fortress. Henry VI, whose reign was devastated by bouts of mental illness, was captured and eventually murdered, probably in the Wakefield Tower. But the most infamous event in the tower's history is the disappearance of the princes. When Edward IV died in April 1483, his 12-year-old son was proclaimed Edward V. The boy's uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, had him brought to the tower to prepare for coronation, then arranged for his 9-year-old brother to join him. The boys were seen playing in the gardens. Then sightings grew rarer. Richard claimed Edward V was illegitimate and was proclaimed Richard III. By late summer, the princes had vanished entirely. Traditional history, most famously told by Thomas More and popularized by Shakespeare, holds that Richard ordered them smothered in their beds. In 1674, workmen found a wooden box containing 2 children's skeletons beneath a staircase in the White Tower. Charles II had the bones placed in Westminster Abbey. Modern forensic analysis has been inconclusive. Richard III's defenders argue Henry Tudor might have ordered the murders to eliminate rival claimants, but Richard's failure to produce the boys alive suggests guilty knowledge. The mystery has inspired countless books, plays, and heated debates for centuries. The truth may never be known. The Tudor period marked the Tower's darkest and most feared hours. It was used less as a royal residence and more as a prison and arsenal. Henry VIII spent £3,500 on repairs in the 1530s, but the medieval castle was increasingly obsolete in an age of gunpowder. Nevertheless, the Tower's reputation peaked during the violent religious upheavals of the 16th century. Thomas More, once Henry VIII's closest advisor, refused to accept the king's break with Rome. He was imprisoned for 15 months and beheaded on Tower Hill on July 6, 1535. He went to his death with remarkable calm, reportedly helping the executioner position his head, remarking that his chin was too short for the sword. Anne Boleyn was accused of adultery with 5 men, including her own brother. The charges were almost certainly fabricated. She was beheaded on May 19, 1536, by a French swordsman brought specially from Calais, considered the best in Europe, producing a cleaner cut than an axe. Catherine Howard, perhaps 17 years old, suffered the same fate in 1542. Lady Jane Grey, the 9 Days' Queen, was beheaded at 17 in 1554. Both were buried in St. Peter ad Vincula. Elizabeth, later Elizabeth I, was imprisoned for 2 months in 1554, suspected of involvement in Wyatt's rebellion. She entered through Traitor's Gate in a rainstorm, sat down on the steps, and refused to move, protesting her innocence. When she became queen 4 years later, she never forgot those months. She avoided the Tower for the rest of her life. Sir Walter Raleigh spent 13 years imprisoned, 1603 to 1616, one of the longest stays in the Tower's history. His wife lived with him. Their son was born there in 1605. He wrote his History of the World behind those walls. Eventually released to seek gold in South America, he failed and was executed upon his return. The tradition of housing the crown jewels in the Tower probably dates from Henry III's reign. The jewel house was constructed specifically for the royal regalia, crowns, scepters, orbs, which were believed to embody kingship itself. They were also investments. Medieval monarchs regularly pawned gems to raise cash, sometimes stripping crowns bare. In 1649, Cromwell destroyed the regalia. The crowns were literally smashed apart, their gold melted down, their gems sold individually. When the monarchy was restored in 1660, almost nothing remained. For Charles II's coronation in 1661, gems had to be rented, a somewhat undignified situation for a newly restored monarchy. The most dramatic moment in the jewels' history came in 1671, when Colonel Thomas Blood attempted to steal them in broad daylight. Blood and 2 accomplices disguised themselves as clergy, overpowered the elderly keeper, and seized the imperial state crown, the orb, and the scepter. They nearly escaped. The jewels were hidden under their robes, and they reached the Tower's gate before the keeper's son arrived and raised the alarm. Blood was captured. Remarkably, he was not executed. After a long private meeting with Charles II, whose contents were never recorded, Blood was pardoned and given a pension of £500 a year. Today, the crown jewels contain 23,578 gemstones. The imperial state crown holds the 2nd star of Africa diamond. The sovereign scepter contains the Cullinan one, the largest gem-quality rough diamond ever found, discovered in South Africa in 1905. The 17th century brought upheaval on a scale England hadn't seen since the Norman conquest. In January 1642, Charles I attempted to arrest 5 members of Parliament, personally entering the House of Commons with soldiers. The 5 had been warned and fled. The king stood looking at empty seats and realized he had made a catastrophic mistake. He left London that day, never to return as king. Parliament immediately seized the tower. By the time the Civil War officially began in November 1642, the fortress was already in parliamentary hands, its arsenal supplying parliamentary armies throughout the war. Charles I was captured in 1646, tried in an unprecedented revolutionary tribunal, and beheaded on January 30th, 1649. England became a republic for the first time. The monarchy was restored in 1660. Charles II's coronation procession from the Tower to Westminster in 1661 was the last such royal tradition ever observed. The castle's accommodation was in such poor condition he didn't even stay the night before, sleeping at Whitehall instead. Then came the Great Fire of London. On September 2nd, 1666, a fire broke out on Pudding Lane and spread with terrifying speed through the city's wooden buildings. Samuel Pepys climbed to the top of the White Tower to assess the threat. By September 4th, the fire was advancing directly toward the tower. The danger was specific and deadly. The tower's magazines were packed with gunpowder. If the fire reached them, the explosion could level the fortress and kill thousands. The garrison took desperate action. They began demolishing houses near the fortress by blowing them up with gunpowder charges, creating fire breaks by removing all combustible material from the fire's path. The tactic worked. The tower survived, though most of the medieval city of London was destroyed. By September 5th, 13,200 houses and 87 churches had burned, including Old St. Paul's Cathedral. At least 6 ravens are kept at the tower at all times, in accordance with a legend that if they ever leave, the kingdom will fall and the tower will crumble to dust. The ravens are cared for by the Raven Master, one of the yeoman warders, who feeds them meat and clips their wings. They have names and personalities, some friendly, some aggressive. The legend's origins are obscure, possibly dating to the 17th century, but it has become so deeply associated with the tower that the ravens are now considered essential to its identity. The tower is one of the most haunted buildings in Britain. Anne Boleyn's ghost is the most frequently reported, supposedly walking the corridors at night, sometimes carrying her severed head under her arm. Her spectre haunts particularly St. Peter ad Vincula, where she is buried. Henry VI is seen in the Wakefield Tower. The princes in the tower appear together, 2 small boys in nightclothes, holding hands, standing silently before vanishing. Perhaps the strangest story involves a sentry outside the Jewel House in January 1816, who reported seeing an apparition of a bear advancing toward him from the darkness. He was so terrified he collapsed and reportedly died a few days later, supposedly of fright. By the 1700s, the tower's military importance had diminished. The garrison shrank, the prison's population declined, and the palace buildings fell into severe disrepair. The 18th and 19th centuries brought a romantic fascination with medieval history, Gothic Revival architecture became fashionable, and the tower gradually transformed from a working fortress into a museum. William Harrison Ainsworth's 1840 novel created a vivid image of underground torture chambers that stuck in the public imagination, establishing the tower's reputation as a place of systematic torture. Though in reality, torture was relatively rare and always required official authorization. More constructively, Ainsworth suggested opening Beauchamp Tower to the public so visitors could see the inscriptions carved by prisoners on its walls. These inscriptions, names, dates, prayers, coats of arms, are the tower's most personal artifacts, the last creative acts of men and women who knew they might die within its walls. The architect Anthony Salvin led a comprehensive restoration at the behest of Prince Albert. His successor, John Taylor, was more ruthless, demolishing historically significant post-medieval buildings and stripping away internal decoration to expose what he imagined the original medieval surfaces had been. The restoration was well-intentioned, but often destructive, replacing historical reality with romantic fantasy. The moat, drained in the 1840s, was filled with earth and grass, becoming a pleasant green space. During the First World War, 11 men were arrested for espionage, secretly communicating with the German government. They were tried in private military tribunals, found guilty, and shot by firing squad at the tower in a prefabricated rifle range set up in the outer ward. The executions took place in secrecy. Their names were not released for years. The tower had become a place of secret execution. The method changed from axe to rifle, but the secrecy remained. The Blitz brought far greater destruction. On September 23, 1940, high explosive bombs struck the tower. Several buildings were destroyed or severely damaged. The White Tower narrowly escaped serious damage. The Waterloo Block, housing the crown jewels, survived intact. Rudolf Hess, Hitler's deputy Führer, arrived in Scotland in May 1941, having flown solo across the North Sea. He claimed he had come to negotiate peace, whether on Hitler's instructions, out of madness, or as a genuine mission remains one of the war's great mysteries. He was held at the tower for 4 days. He was the last state prisoner ever held there. The last execution at the tower was Joseph Jacobs, a German spy captured in January 1941 after parachuting into Scotland and breaking his ankle. He was tried by military tribunal and shot on August 15, 1941. Because he hadn't been wearing a military uniform when captured, he was executed in civilian clothes. He insisted on sitting down, his ankle made standing painful, and was shot in a chair. The last person executed at the tower, ending a tradition stretching back to the 16th century. After the war, the tower was repaired and reopened. Its role had changed fundamentally. It was no longer a fortress, prison, or military installation. It was a museum, a monument, a piece of living history. Today, it receives approximately 3 million visitors each year. The yeoman warders, the beefeaters, remain one of its most distinctive features. These are retired soldiers who have served at least 22 years in the British Armed Forces. They wear Tudor-era uniforms embroidered with gold thread and deliver tours that combine historical accuracy with theatrical storytelling. The ceremony of the keys, held every evening, is one of Britain's oldest military ceremonies. The resident governor conducts the formal locking of the gates, escorted by soldiers and yeoman warders carrying lanterns. At each gate, a sentry challenges, "Who goes there?" The resident governor of His Majesty's Royal Palace and Fortress of the Tower of London. "Pass, resident governor." The script has remained essentially unchanged for centuries. In 1988, the tower was added to the UNESCO World Heritage List. But challenges have emerged. Surrounding skyscrapers, the cheese grater, the walkie-talkie, have pushed the tower toward the Heritage in Danger list. Since 1990, the tower has been cared for by Historic Royal Palaces, an independent charity receiving no government funding. The medieval palace rooms were restored and opened to the public in 2006, allowing visitors to explore spaces where kings lived 700 years ago. Chapter 18. 1,000 years. The Tower of London stands today as a monument to 1,000 years of British history. It has been a palace, a fortress, a prison, a place of execution, a royal treasury, a mint, an arsenal, and now a museum. Its walls have witnessed the coronation of kings and the beheading of queens. It has housed saints and murderers, victims and executioners, lovers and conspirators. Stand on the banks of the Thames and look at the tower as it rises from the riverbank. The same view that Norman soldiers, Tudor courtiers, Victorian tourists, and Blitz survivors all shared. The White Tower still gleams. The curtain walls still rise. The ravens still circle overhead, their harsh cries echoing across the water. And the Thames still flows past, as it has for millennia. The tower has outlasted the monarchs who built it. William the Conqueror has been dead for over 900 years, but his fortress still stands. Henry III has been dead for 750 years, but his walls remain intact. Anne Boleyn has been dead for nearly 500 years, but her ghost still walks the corridors at night. What makes the tower truly extraordinary is not its age, nor its architecture, nor even its history. It is the sheer density of human experience it contains. Every stone was cut by human hands. Every wall was built by human labor. Every prisoner who paced its corridors, every monarch who held court within its walls, every soldier who defended it, every tourist who walks through its gates today, all are part of the tower's story. The building is not just a structure, it is a vessel holding the accumulated weight of 1,000 years of human hope, fear, ambition, cruelty, beauty, and survival. 1,000 years from now, when we are all forgotten, the tower will likely still stand, keeping its secrets, bearing witness to history, casting its shadow over the Thames exactly as William the Conqueror intended on that December day in 1066, when everything changed forever. The stones remember everything, the ravens watch, and the river flows on.